Hey everyone, it's Taylorverse, and welcome back to the Serial Killer Files. Now, before we begin, I have that little ad. I'm just gonna get it over real quick. You can go to bodycandy.com for high quality, low priced body jewelry. And you can get 25% off at checkout with code TaylorCurtis25. On with the show. Henry Louis Wallace. In restricting himself to victims of his own race, another African-American psychopath, Henry Louis Wallace, was more typical of serial killers in general. Though he deviated from the usual pattern in another regard. Whereas most serial killers prey on strangers, Wallace murdered a string of acquaintances. Between September 1992 and March 1994, the crack-addicted Wallace raped and strangled 9 young black women in and around Charlotte, North Carolina, all people who knew and trusted him. Some were employees at the Taco Bell he managed to. Fuck Taco Bell. Oh, Taco Bell has upset me so bad. They were literally my favorite. Like, I was a stan. And then they get rid of the fucking chips and cheese and the fucking cheesy fiesta potatoes and everything that includes the potatoes in it. And like, every single time I went to Taco Bell, I got a crunch wrap, some cheesy fiesta potatoes, and some chips and cheese. Like, bitch, you ruined my whole order. And I always said to my mom, I want to swim in a vat of this fucking cheese. And they took it away. Bitch. I haven't had Taco Bell since. And I won't have Taco Bell until it's back. I'm just saying. I tweeted at them. I said I ain't gonna come back until you put that back on the menu. Because I ate it every time. And you done fucked up my order. I'm not coming back. And it hurts my soul. It really hurts. Like Taco Bell. You know how people are like, my hair's dyed pink. It's neon and it's my personality. I love Taco Bell so much, it's part of my personality. Anyway. Several worked with his girlfriend. One was his girlfriend's roommate. Others knew his sister. As with many serial killers, the pace of Wallace's crimes escalated over time. His first 6 murders occurred over a 20-month span, his final 3 within 72 hours. Finally arrested in January 1994, he promptly confessed to all 9 killings and was sentenced to death. Because they were slow to acknowledge a link among Wallace's earliest murders, the Charlotte police were accused of racism, of failing to take the case seriously because the victims were black. Carlton Gray, another notorious black serial killer, had particular taste when it came to victims, who only killed outside his race, limiting himself to female Caucasians. He also liked his women old, abandoned by his father, and shuttled from pillar to post throughout his hardscrabble childhood. Gary accumulated a long rap sheet for robbery, arson, and drug dealing while still in his teens. His combination of exceptional intelligence, glib charm, and psychopathic cunning made him especially dangerous. At one point in his life, he was dating a female deputy sheriff while pushing drugs and committing serial murder on the side. Arrested in May 1970 as a suspect in the rape murder of an 85-year-old Albany, New York woman, Gary managed to pin the blame on an acquaintance. Eventually, after several stints behind bars on lesser charges, he escaped from prison and made his way back to his native city, Columbus, Georgia. Between September 1977 and April 1978, that city was rocked by a string of murders committed by a shadowy intruder dubbed the Stalking Strangler. His victims were 7 white women, the youngest 59, the oldest just shy of 90. After embarking on a string of restaurant holdups, Gary was arrested for armed robbery in 1978 and sentenced to 20 years in jail. 4 years later, however, he escaped. He wasn't nabbed for good until May 1984, charged with 3 of the Stalking Strangler murders. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to die in Georgia's electric chair. Other African-American serial killers include... Oh, shit. Oh, I thought, oh no. Coral Watts, diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, Watts began dreaming of killing women in his childhood. When a psychiatrist asked if these dreams disturbed him, Watts replied, "No, I feel better after I have one." He first assaulted a woman when he was 15 years old. When asked about his motives, he shrugged. "I felt like beating her up." He began to make his homicidal dreams a reality in 1980 when he terrorized Ann Arbor, Michigan, as the Sunday morning slasher. Falling under suspicion, he relocated to Houston, where he killed an indeterminate number of women, perhaps as many as 40. Finally arrested in 1982, he struck a controversial deal with the prosecutor's office, confessing to 13 murders in exchange for a burglary conviction and 60-year sentence. Despite a public outcry, he is slated to be paroled in 2006 at the age of 58. She was evil. I could see it in her eyes. Coral Watts explaining his reasons for killing one of his 13 admitted victims. Alton Coleman. During a 53-day period in the summer of 1984, Coleman, along with his female accomplice Deborah Brown, murdered 8 people in 5 Midwestern states, beginning with 7-year-old Tamika Turks of Gary, Indiana. After raping the little girl, Coleman jumped up and down on her chest until her rib cage fractured and punctured her vital organs. Shit. That's a hell of a way to go. Poor kid. And I hate kids. Ugh. His other victims, all black, ranged in age from 15 to 77. Some were strangled, some stabbed, others bludgeoned or shot. Besides serial murder, Coleman committed at least 7 rapes during this period, as well as 3 kidnappings and 14 armed robberies. Arrested in July 1984, he was tried and convicted in 3 different states: Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana. He managed to delay his execution until April 26, 2002, when, after devouring a last meal of filet mignon, fried chicken, cornbread, biscuits with brown gravy, French fries, broccoli with cheese, salad, onion rings, collard greens, sweet potato pie with whipped cream, and butter pecan ice cream, he was put to death by lethal injection. Relatives of his many victims watched on closed-circuit TV. Celiophus Prince Jr. Unlike most serial killers, Prince preyed exclusively on victims outside his own race. Between January and September 1990, he brutally murdered 6 women in the San Diego community of Claremont, stabbing one of them more than 50 times and leaving bloody circles smeared on his victims' breasts as a signature. His MO involved following unsuspecting women to their homes, then breaking in and butchering them with a kitchen knife. Like Alton Coleman, whose victims included an Ohio woman and her 10-year-old daughter, Prince murdered a mother and daughter, then bragged about the double killing to a friend who took to wearing the dead woman's wedding ring on a chain around his neck. Shit. Dubbed the Claremont Killer, during his 9-month reign of terror, he was the object of the largest police manhunt in the history of San Diego. Arrested in September 1991, he was eventually convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder, 20 counts of burglary, and 1 count of rape. He remains on San Quentin's death row, awaiting execution. Case study: Wayne Williams and the Atlanta child murders. More than 20 years after the accused perpetrator was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment, questions continue to surround the case of the so-called Atlanta child murders. The story began in July 1979 when a woman scavenging the roadside for empties stumbled on the corpses of 2 African-American boys, one shot in the head with a .22 caliber pistol, the other asphyxiated. Over the next 2 years, 27 more victims would be added to the official list of homicides connected to the killer. During that fearful time, the case would spark panic and outrage in Atlanta's black community, generate nationwide media attention, including an article in the New York Times Magazine that would feature the earliest documented use of the term serial killer, and bring help from the highest reaches of the government, up to and including the president himself. And not even the arrest and conviction of the prime suspect put an end to the controversy. Right from the start, the killings posed an enormous problem for law enforcement agents. There was no consistency, no identifiable signature in terms of the killer's MO. Most of the victims were strangled, but some were shot, others stabbed or bludgeoned to death. And though most of the victims were males, a few were young girls. On March 4th, 1980, for example, 12-year-old Angel Lanier left her house to play after completing her homework and never returned. 6 days later, her body was found lashed to a tree, and an electrical cord tied around her neck and someone else's panties stuffed down her throat. As his reign of terror continued, moreover, the killer began to prey on older victims. 20-year-old Larry Rogers, 21-year-old Eddie Duncan, 23-year-old Michael McIntosh. I've never seen it written like that. 27-year-old Nathaniel Cater. By the spring of 1980, the city's African-American community was in an uproar over the failure of the police to stop the killings. Rumors swirled that the Ku Klux Klan was on a campaign to annihilate the black youth of Atlanta, while Roy Enos of the Congress of Racial Equality went public with a theory that the murders were the work of a satanic cult. Dozens of bounty hunters, drawn by the prospect of a $100,000 reward, descended on the city. Celebrities from Burt Reynolds to Muhammad Ali offered financial assistance, while President Reagan pledged federal funds to help track down the killer. A special task force, including 35 FBI agents, interviewed 20,000 people in person and another 150,000 over the phone. The case began to break in the early morning hours of May 22, 1981, when officers on a stakeout at a bridge over the Chattahoochee River heard a loud splash and halted the car that was crossing the span. Its driver was 23-year-old African-American named Wayne Williams. There was certainly nothing in Williams' background that matched the typical profile of a serial killer. The son of a schoolteacher, parents, he grew up in a stable and loving household where he was encouraged to cultivate his talents. A radio enthusiast who dreamed of making it big in the music business, he showed a great deal of early promise. By the time he was 16, he was broadcasting music from a radio station he had set up in the basement of his home. Besides electronics, he had a keen interest in photography and became highly skilled with a camera. Still, there were definite signs that he was not right with the enterprising young Williams. Despite his intelligence and ambition, he couldn't make it through college, dropping out of Georgia State after just 1 year. His dreams of discovering the next Stevie Wonder came to nothing. and he gained a reputation as a blowhard and liar, the kind of person who claims to have important contacts and is always making big promises that never pan out. An extreme loner, he had no real social relationships and continued to live with his parents into his 20s. He also began displaying some troubling behavioral traits, including a fondness for impersonating police officers, a common tendency among serial killers, as well as a morbid interest in accident scenes. The grislier the better. Monitoring police transmissions on his soft shortwave, he rushed to the sites of car wrecks or fires or even plane crashes, shooting photographs and videos, then peddling them to the local media. After being stopped on the bridge, Williams was questioned and let go. 2 days later, however, a corpse was fished out of the river, and he was brought into the station for another grilling. Afterward, playing to the media, he staged an at-home news conference, loudly proclaiming his innocence and offering various alibis that subsequently proved to be full of holes. While the police put him under the round-the-clock surveillance, forensic specialists worked frantically to link him to the crimes. One FBI scientists were finally able to match fibers and dog hairs found on several of the victims to Williams' car mats, home carpeting, and bird spread. Police moved in and arrested him on June 21, 1981. At his 9-week trial, the prosecution portrayed Williams as a violent homosexual. Why does that matter? Filled with racial self-loathing, who harbored a virulent contempt for black youths. Witnesses were produced who testified to having seen Williams in the company of several victims. Toward the end of the trial, the defense put Williams on the stand, but the tactic backfired when he was goaded into a display of uncontrolled anger, denouncing the prosecutor as a fool and lashing out at various government agents. In the end, despite his impassioned protestations of innocence, my vision just fucking blurred. He was convicted of 2 counts of murder and given life sentence for each. Even today, many people believe that Williams was railroaded, that the circumstantial evidence on which he was convicted was flimsy at best and possibly manufactured by the government. That key information might have aided his case was suppressed, that Williams received inadequate representation. One fact, however, suggests that the cops got the right man after all. Once Williams was arrested, the Atlanta child murder stopped. Young and old, killer kids who commit mass murder have become an all-too-common feature of contemporary American society. During the late 1990s, there seemed to be a veritable epidemic of them. 16-year-old Luke, good Lord, Cat, Woodham of Pearl, Mississippi, who killed 3 schoolmates and wounded 7 after knifing to death his own mother. 14-year-old Michael Carneal of West Paducah, Kentucky, who gunned down 3 fellow students and wounded 5 others at an early morning prayer meeting. 15-year-old Kip Kinkle of Springfield, Oregon, who murdered his parents, then shot 24 students, killing 2. Andrew Golden and Mitchell Johnson, ages 11 and 13, who set off a fire alarm at school to draw their classmates outside, then opened fire, killing 4 students and a teacher. Oh, I knew this one would be mentioned. And of course, the Columbine killers. 17-year-old Dylan Klebold and 18-year-old Eric Harris, whose April 1999 massacre in Littleton, Colorado, left a dozen students and a teacher dead and 23 other people wounded. Oop! Hi, kitty. Come on. Yeah. By contrast, serial murder perpetrated by minors is an exceptionally rare phenomenon. You scared the fuck out of me. The most infamous case in American history is that of Jesse Harding Pomeroy, the Boston boy fiend, whose criminal career began when he was 12. During a 9-month reign of terror that began in December 1871, Pomeroy lured a string of smaller boys to remote locations in Chelsea and South Boston, then bound, beat, and tortured them. Arrested and shipped to reform school, he was released after less than 17 months, whereupon he promptly committed a pair of appalling mutilation murders on a 10-year-old girl and a 4-year-old boy. Pomeroy was only 14 when he was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. A controversy immediately erupted over the morality of executing a minor, and his sentence was ultimately commuted to life. He lived until 1932, having spent just over 40 years of his nearly 60 years incarceration in solitary confinement, the second longest such stretch in U.S. penal history. I think I've heard this one. I don't know. Okay. What? Oh, okay. Though Pomeroy began torturing children when he was 12, he didn't graduate to homicide until he was 14, which makes Craig Price of Warwick, Rhode Island, the youngest serial killer in U.S. history. During the late 1980s, at the age of 13, the black youth who had been peeping on a neighborhood woman named Rebecca Spencer broke into her house and killed her with a kitchen knife. 2 years later, he stabbed to death another local woman, Joan Heaton, and her 2 daughters, ages 8 and 10. Dubbed a slasher of Warwick, he was arrested when a detective noticed a large cut on his hand. Freely confessing to the murders, he was sent to the state prison in Cranston and is scheduled for parole in 2019. That's last year. Wow. Wonder how that went. Case study. Mary Bell, the British bad seed. The savage murder of a pair of preschoolers by a psychopathic killer who exults in the atrocities is appalling enough. But when the killer turns out to be a child too, and even more shockingly an 11-year-old girl with a heart-shaped face and big blue eyes, the crime is guaranteed to set off an explosion of horror, outrage, and stunned disbelief. This is precisely what happened in the summer of 1968 when Britain was rocked by a case of Mary Bell, arguably the most notorious juvenile psycho killer of the 20th century. Because of her youth and angelic appearance, Mary has sometimes been described as the British bad seed, a reference to the 1956 movie about a pretty pigtailed schoolgirl whose picture-perfect exterior conceals the heart of a psychopathic monster. The comparison is only partially valid. The fictional bad seed was raised in a loving, stable household by a devoted mommy and daddy. Her evil was innate. Mary Bell, by contrast, was made into a monster. Raised by a viciously depraved young prostitute, the little girl was allegedly subjected to unimaginable abuse, held down by her mother while strange men sexually brutalized her. In light of the soul-deforming horrors she suffered from her earliest years, it is little wonder that Mary Bell herself became a cold-blooded predator. During her nightmarish childhood, she manifested the classic symptoms that experts see as a predictor of serial murder: cruelty to animals, abnormally prolonged bedwetting, and vandalism, though not as often is the case pyromania. That she cannot technically be classified as a serial killer, at least according to the FBI's definition, is only because her victim count fell 1 short of the minimum. However, there is little doubt that Bell would have continued taking lives had she been able to. Her violent attacks on other children began during the second week of May 1968, when within 24 hours, she and her best friend Norma assaulted 4 little acquaintances in Scotswood, a dreary, economically depressed industrial community in northern England. 10 days later, on May 25th, the body of 3-year-old Martin Brown was found in a derelict house, blood and saliva bubbling from his mouth. It was Mary who excitedly ran to tell the boy's aunt, Rita Finley. In the succeeding days, Mary and Norma showed up repeatedly at Mrs. Finley's house to plague her with tormenting questions. Do you miss Martin? Do you cry for him? Finally, unable to stand it any longer, the grieving woman threw the grinning children out of her house and told them never to return. 2 days after the discovery of Martin's body, the local nursery was vandalized by intruders who left the place a wreck. Amid the debris, police found 4 taunting notes written in childish hand, including one that read, "Reed did murder Martin Brown. Fuck off, you bastard." Mm. Mm. Well, I mean, right to the point. 2 months passed. On Wednesday, July 31st, another 3-year-old Scotswood boy, Brian Howe, went missing. When his worried older sister Pat went looking for him, she ran into Mary Bell and Norma, who eagerly offered to search for the toddler. I think I've heard this one too. Isn't there like a movie with this one? That's like based off this one loosely? Am I making that up? Please comment below if there's a fucking movie, because I feel like there's a fucking movie that's like loosely based off this. Or maybe it was a book, but there's some sort of fiction loosely based. Fuck, it could be a video game. I know there's something though. Please help me. My brain does not work. But I know this story, but I've never heard of this exact. Do you know what I mean? Mary led the girl to a stretch of industrial waste ground where local children liked to play and where Brian's corpse was later discovered between 2 concrete blocks. The little boy had been strangled and sexually mutilated with a broken pair of scissors that lay nearby. The letter M had been carved into his naked belly with a razor. Before long, investigators focused their suspicions on Mary and Norma. At Brian's funeral on August 7th, Chief Inspector James Dobson kept an eye on Mary Bell. I watched her as she stood in front of house while the coffin was brought out. He would later explain. That was when I knew I couldn't risk another day. She stood there laughing and rubbing her hands. I thought, my God, I've got to bring her in or she'll do another one. Brought to the police station for questioning, Mary and Norma accused each other of the murder of Brian Howe. The 2 girls were brought to trial in December. After 9 days, Norma was acquitted, while Mary, labeled a cunning, remorseless psychopath by experts, was sentenced to detention for life. Her later life has been marked by periodic controversy and public uproar. At first, she was placed in a reform school where, within 2 years, she accused a housemaster of sexual assault. Later, she was transferred to a prison where she declared herself a lesbian and paraded around with a rolled-up stocking stuffed in her crotch of her pants. In 1977, she was transferred to a less secure facility from which she promptly escaped. Though she was quickly captured again, she was at large long enough to lose her virginity to a young man, who later sold his story to the tabloids. Shortly before her parole in 1980, she was moved to a halfway house, where she promptly managed to get pregnant by a married man. She aborted that pregnancy, but became a mother in 1984 after her release from jail. Eventually, she settled in a small town, but was driven out by angry residents when they discovered her true identity. The quiet, anonymous life she finally managed to construct for herself and her child was shattered in 1998 with the publication of Gita Serenity's Cries Unheard, which ignited a firestorm when the author disclosed that she had paid the one-time child murderer for her participation. Overage serial killers are just as rare as juvenile ones. Albert Fish, arguably the most perverted figure in the annals of American crime, was a genuine geriatric monster. In 1928, the grandfatherly-looking fish lured a 12-year-old girl to an abandoned house in Westchester, New York, then strangled her, butchered her body, and carried away several pounds of her flesh, which he proceeded to make into a stew and consume in the state of extreme sexual excitation over the course of a week. He was finally captured after sending an unspeakable letter to the little girl's mother, in which he gloatingly described every atrocity he had perpetrated on the child. He was electrocuted in 1936 at the age of 65, becoming the oldest man ever put to death in Sing Sing. And I'm going to stop there. We're going to call it a day. We are never getting through this. Long-ass book. Ooh. Anyway, that just means more fun. More fucked up things. Okay. I will see you all later. Bye.